Good morning. It is 9 a.m. and I'll call to order the Board of Directors special meeting workshop for Tuesday, May 6, 2025. May I have a roll call, please?
Director Meyerhoffen?
Here.
Director Duff?
Present.
Director Martin?
Present.
Vice President Griffith? President Sewell?
Here.
Thank you. We have quorum.
And I will just note that Vice President gave me advance notice his absent is excused. No one's participating remotely. We'll skip item 3. Pledge of Allegiance. Director Martin, would you like to do this? Or we can skip it, or since it's just a workshop.
No, I don't care. Let's do it. Come on.
Let's do it.
You mention it.
Now that you said it,
It's on there.
Please join me in saluting our nation's flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag, United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We went at a little faster clip today. Item 5, public input. This is the opportunity for members of the public to address the board on matters within the board's jurisdiction. Please limit comments to 3 minutes or less. State law prohibits the board from discussing or taking action on any items not listed on the agenda. Do we have any members of the public wishing to address the board today?
President Sewell, we do not.
Thank you. Discussion items. Item 6, Aqua election process for 2026-27 nominations. General Manager.
Thank you, President Sewell, members of the board. On the dais today, as well as for the public, there are copies of 2 different memos from Aqua, one being the one specific for the president and vice president of Aqua. The other one is the election process for Region 9, which I think is more important to us from a local perspective, and I think of more interest. So this is a workshop. It's open for discussion. There are dates and timelines in there. I don't know that we have to discuss it openly today, but if there's any specific interest that the staff can support the board in any of the, either 2 of the elections or casting our vote at the conference in December, please let us know and we'll be able to support the board. But
I have a question there, Ed. For Region 9, is that for chairman and vice chairman, or is that for just for Region 9 board member?
I didn't read the memo that close, but I believe it's for the board as well as possibly the election of those officers.
Okay.
from what I can see, Director, it appears to be all of those positions.
Yeah.
So it'll be for all 5 board members and the chair and vice chair. So
Okay.
they're looking for
Region 9. Okay.
7 people.
So they're looking for board members, then they vote for who they want? They have the board members that's a vote? How many how it goes?
I don't see this missing.
As I recall, usually we get a ballot. So anybody that we want to nominate for the ballot, it goes on the ballot and you can nominate yourself or whoever for vice president and president. And then that shows up to the ballot that then we receive. And then we cast 1 vote for the organization.
I remember now.
Okay.
And it looks like July, so I mean, ideally,
June 20th, I believe the documents have to be submitted, right?
Historically, and I've discussed this before, Manager Mason, historically, on there, the president, vice president of Aqua has been made up of people who were presently sitting on the board, and then the election was for the people who joined the board to replace those board members and move into those positions. And I think 1 or 2 elections in the past that changed, where somebody came in cold and was able to get right to the presidency. So I certainly would be open to being one as a board member, but not as president or vice president. I don't know enough about the inner workings of the Aqua to make that decision. Not that anybody was necessarily select me, but I just throw it out there.
great. Well, I think look over the information and we can have this as a discussion for this month's board meeting.
We can either have it for this month's board meeting. I know that the board meeting is going to be a little bit unique in that we're starting a little bit early because some of us have to travel later in the day. May I suggest the workshop that we'll have in June?
Okay.
And then we can then bring it to the board for decision in June before the 20th.
Okay. Perfect. Any other discussion today? All right. Item 7, long-range financial plan. General Manager.
Thank you, President Sewell, members of the board. Long-range financial plan is something that myself and the Director of Finance, Arturo Ceja, have been working on for over a year and a half with Raf Tillis, our consultant, who went through the normal RF qualifications for request for qualifications process. Right now, what we're going to be presenting to you as a workshop is the first couple of steps of the long-range financial plan. The first thing you want to look at in a long-range financial plan is what expenses do you expect to see for the next 5, 10, 15 years, and also what revenues do you expect? So Raf Tillis for the last year and a half has been going through our audited financial statements, our budget of this year, and trying to forecast what those would be. As we expected, not to take away from the presentation, but at this particular point, we do have positive cash flow this year, and we expect to have that moving forward. The issue, in one of the funds, the other fund gets a little bit questionable, and we'll talk about that. But in reality, the CIP program that we have, some of them are needed because resiliency, some of them are necessary just because remove and replace, or they need to be replaced, and then some of them are regulatory, like the Chrome 6. When we start putting in the capital projects, that's when the budget starts to show some pressure, if you will, and dipping into reserves. So with that context, Raf Tillis is going to give a presentation, and they're going to show what the impacts to these capital improvement projects are. There's a couple of different things to keep in mind. One, there is no assumed grant. For example, Terrace Reservoir, we've postponed for the last 3 or 4 years because we're chasing a $5 million grant through EOS. I still got that wrong. Is it EOS? Oh, yes. Excuse me. I knew I had it wrong. So that will show up there, but it will not have the grant component with that. So when you look at the capital numbers, just keep in mind that there is no grants associated with that. The M2, of course, because we've already secured that, it does show up on our wastewater side. So we're presenting to you the raw data, if you will. What we're doing after this will be, okay, do we want to move some of these projects out? Do we want to go out and capital bond for some of this to try to offset and level the big impacts of some of these projects? But I just wanted to bring you up the board up to speed of where we are from a revenue perspective. So with that being said, Arturo, is there anything you'd like to add? Okay. John, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your team and start with the presentation, the floor is yours.
Well, the general manager just made my presentation for me, so Ryan went into a lot of detail there. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm John Wright with Raf Tillis, and up until about 4 months ago, I was based in the Temecula-Murrieta area of Southern California. I'm now based in Austin, Texas, and with me today is Elise Ritchie, and Elise is sort of the frontline consultant working with me in the development of the financial plans and eventually cost of service study and rate design. So let me try to share my screen here and show you the presentation we've put together with Arturo and Brian's help. And I'm not really a Zoom guy, so are you guys seeing my screen right now?
Yes, we are.
Beautiful, thank you. And how about now? I hope it's on full screen for you.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, what we're going to do is talk about project scope today, sort of as a lead off, and it'll be very quick. I think that as Brian noted, we've been under contract to the district for a good year and a half. And so it's been a little bit of an extended process. So it might be wise to go back and review what the district has hired us to do. Also give a little bit of background on the rate study process. Then talk about financial planning and just give a high level overview of the financial planning process. And then finally, just show you some of the revenues and expenses, both in the water and sewer utility operations as a way to get started. So this is what the district retained the services of my firm to do, is to develop water and sewer financial plans, one for a 10-year planning horizon and then a longer term 30-year. Water and sewer cost of service, water and sewer rate design, assistance with the Prop 218 notice preparation, attendance at your Prop 218 hearing. And you'll really have two hearings. One is to issue the notice, and then a formal Prop 218 hearing where you will implement proposed rates if you choose to do so. And then there's an optional service my firm may provide depending on what your needs are, which is public outreach assistance. So just looking at the rate study process, we really start out understanding what your needs are in terms of your financial situation, your long-term CIP, what your desires are in the way of possible changes to your rate structure. And that's the study framework. And as we move forward to the right, we get into the process of developing financial plans and forecasting the revenue requirement. And the revenue requirement is basically the amount of rate revenue you need to cover your projected costs. And in this rate study process, we are in the financial planning and revenue requirement forecasting phase. Once we complete financial plans and revenue requirement forecasting, then we'll move into the development of a cost of service study, which will identify the amount of rate revenue we need to recover from each of your customer classes, and the design of rates, the specific utility rates that will recover that revenue from each class. And then finally, there's a rate adoption process, which is the entire California Prop 218 process that involves noticing your customers, having Prop 218 hearings. And between cost of service and rate design and the rate adoption process, we'll be drafting a comprehensive report for you. Two things to note. Number one, across the top, we see an arrow that says Prop 218 compliance. And so we're really trying to keep that in the front of our minds, actually, throughout this rate study process, that we're recovering costs that are appropriate to provide water and sewer service. We're allocating cost to classes in a manner that reflects the proportionate demands different types of customers place on the system. And we're coming up with proposed rates that recover those costs. And those rates have to be very much cost justified under Prop 218. Now, for some clients, down at the bottom, you'll see an arrow going across that says public outreach. And clients will differ. Some clients really won't have very much stakeholder outreach. A lot of clients will have an outreach process throughout the entire rate study process from beginning to end. So when we think about financial planning, really the goal is to come up with what I would call an optimal financing strategy. So let's just talk a minute about what an optimal financial planning strategy is. And it differs from utility to utility. It differs from governing body to governing body. But it's basically the combination of projected rates and, if the governing body so chooses, external debt financing, as well as possibly other sources of cash inflows, such as grants or connection/capacity fees that will achieve what the governing body wants to achieve. And what the governing body usually wants to achieve is rate increases for customers that are, as much as possible, small, smooth, and predictable. Oftentimes that will include the use of external debt financing in a judicious manner. And so it's that whole mix of sources of revenue and cash flows that'll be used to cover your costs. And within that process, what we start off with is, on the left-hand side in the gray box, is a projection of revenues at current rates. We'll develop a demand forecast and ask ourselves, how much growth are you going to see in terms of customer account growth and in terms of water sales or associated wastewater discharges? And what level of rate revenue are we going to obtain under our current rate structure? Then as the next step, what we do is we project your costs. And this would be all of your costs, operating costs, CIP, debt service, and also the creation of adequate cash reserves and meeting your debt service coverage requirements, which fall under the heading of costs. But where the revenues are at current rates, these projected costs build into them assumed inflation. So there are inflation adjustments, for example, for O&M costs or construction cost inflation built into our capital improvement expenditures. So revenue at current rates versus inflation adjusted costs. And invariably, what that causes us to identify is a revenue shortfall, where our current rates can't cover projected costs and we have a funding gap. Now, the outcome of analyzing all of that are the outputs on the right here in yellow. And that's this optimal financing strategy. That strategy, once again, of rate revenue, possible debt revenue, possible grants, possible capacity fees to close that funding gap. A projection of the revenue requirement, the annual amount of revenues you need to collect from ratepayers, and then, of course, an identification of the annual percentage increases in rate revenue, 5% a year, 10%, whatever it may be. The thing to note about the financial planning process is it's very much an iterative process. And I think it's important to just kind of walk through this with you. I'm going to start with the operating context in the upper right. This is really understanding, for example, in the case of a water utility, what your water supply sources are, your groundwater-based system at the district. But many utilities are buying water from Metropolitan Water District or a MET member agency. What does that mean in terms, for example, of MET's projected rate increases over the long term? What does it mean in terms of state water project supplies? What is your operating context in terms of regulatory requirements? For example, on the water utility side for the district, you've got your chromium regulatory requirements that you need to comply with. And also what's happening with your service territory? What's the profile of your customers in terms of your, I'll call it customer account demographics? And how are land use patterns changing for your utilities? Many utilities are moving away from single family residential to much higher density multifamily in a big way. And what might that mean for future demand? The second thing we want to try to understand in the financial planning process are what are your financial policies? And specifically what we're talking about here are things like your policies regarding the maintenance of cash reserves or the maintenance of a target debt service coverage, which is perhaps in excess of what your contractually required debt service coverage is. And also what policies a utility may have in terms of financing capital improvement expenditures. Many utilities try to finance their growth-related capital improvement expenditures through connection fees / capacity charges. Many utilities have a policy that they don't want to issue debt unless it is growth-related, and they want to pay for repair and replacement capital out of rates. So it's important to understand those policies because it helps us zero in on what the optimal financing strategy might be. Next comes demand forecasting water sales revenue, forecasting customer account growth, and also taking into consideration the possible decline in water consumption over the long term as customers use water more efficiently, and also as the state of California imposes limitations on customer demand. The funding gap analysis, which you've already talked about, the optimal financing strategy that we've talked about, the development of that forecast of rate revenues or the revenue requirement. And that whole process to get to the optimal capital financing strategy, and the revenue requirement takes place in scenario analysis. And it's a very iterative process. For example, it may be that a board will, or a governing body will have us look at a scenario that uses no debt and covers all of projected future costs with rate increases. The board may look at the results of that and decide that they now want to look at a scenario with debt. So it's kind of a rolling iterative process involving executive staff and the governing body. Now, within the context of the financial plans that we're working on for the district right now, we based our forecast costs and our forecast revenues off your FY26 budget. And currently, there's an assumption of 2.1% customer account growth, which we're applying right now across all of your customer classes. Then we're also assuming that every year we have a very slight decline in per account water consumption. It's very minor. We're also showing here on this slide what our current inflation assumptions are. And as you can see, utilities is at 7.5%. I think the most recent Southern California Edison increase by the California PUC was 7.1. So we're building in a pretty big electric power cost. And right now for both utilities, we're assuming that we want to maintain an operating cash reserve equivalent to 25% of your annual O&M costs. And it's pretty common to have an operating reserve in the 25 to 50% range of annual O&M. My own feeling about this operating reserve on the water side is that if the board elects to make changes in your water rate structure, we may want to adjust the operating reserve upward to have a little bit more cash on hand. The capital reserve we're showing right now is 50% of annual depreciation expense. There's a whole bunch of different ways to calculate capital reserves, but I think this is adequate for right now. And I may need Arturo to correct me, but I think 50% of annual depreciation expense is actually a district policy right now. Okay, so getting into the meat of this, what Brian and Arturo and Elise and I would like to show you today is just walk you through water and sewer revenue items and also water and sewer cost items for you to get a familiarity with what some of the inputs are going to be in the development of these financial plans. And within the context of looking at rate revenues, we see in lines 1 through 4 a projection of water rate revenues. And those water rate revenues grow a little bit from year to year based on our customer account growth rate. They're really composed of meter charges and consumption charges. Right now, it looks like your meter charges produce a fixed revenue stream that's approximately 25% of your total rate revenues. But it's important to note that the district, in addition to rate revenues, also earns various forms of non-rate revenues. And I can pull up a detail of what some of these non-rate revenues are, but you see items in number 7, line 7 and line 8 that are fairly significant. And I do have a detail of those if you'd like to look at them. And you also see in line 9, interest income. As you can kind of see in line 9, our interest income is fading and getting lower and lower starting in year 26 to year 30. And that's because our cash reserves go negative, which I'll be showing you momentarily. Now, the important thing to note about what you're looking at here is these water rate revenues assume no rate increases. They're just projected revenue at current rates, no rate increases, because as we try to assess that funding gap I talked about previously, it'll be revenues at existing rates compared to projected expenses. So let's look at our water cost projections. try to group our operating costs into, major categories, as we see in rows 13 through 20. In addition to salaries and benefits and electric power, which we would consider to be, obvious major operating costs for any utilities. Another interesting cost is in line 18, which is the allocation of the district's general and administrative expenses. And those are, in effect, your overhead costs for your functions like finance, IT, and then I've categorized maybe 15 or 20 other expenses in line 19 into this category of other, just to be able to fit it onto the slide here. And in row 20, we come to an overall operating costs. And I want you to follow along with me and go to the far right-hand side of row 20. There's a column that's labeled growth. And you see a value there of 3.6%. That's actually the compound annual growth rate from 25 to 30 in operating costs. They're growing at an annual compound rate of 3.6%. Now, there is a minor amount of debt service associated with your water utility operations shown in line 22. And what all of these operating costs and the debt service sum to is a total expenditure in line 23. And when we subtract our projected total revenues with rates at current levels from our projected total expenditures in line 23, we come to a net operating cash flow. I think what's interesting about what we're seeing here in net operating cash flow is it's very much like Brian indicated in his preliminary remarks today, which is basically on the water side, you are covering your net operating cash flow costs. You see numbers there in red, but those numbers are very much handled by your existing cash reserves. Then in line 27, you do see a projection of cash reserves. And the interesting thing to note about this is that as we move forward in the years, we are dramatically pulling down our cash reserves. And we're getting to the point where in FY29, we're projecting negative cash reserves. Now, so what's the point of this? Well, the point of this is we need to close that funding gap because we're drawing down our cash reserves below zero. And that will be, as we begin to solve various financial planning scenarios, some combination of rates and potentially external debt financing. And as Brian noted in his preliminary comments, maybe also grant financing. And because we're having negative net operating cash flow, you can also see in line 29 that we are getting to a point where we're falling below our debt service coverage target, which right now is 1.2 times. That's the debt service coverage that you would usually associate with, for example, a California state revolving loan. And we fall below that 1.2 times in FY26 there at 0.77. Okay, now, here's an important thing to note. I've listed CIP expenditures here at the bottom in row 31. Those CIP expenditures are not currently reflected in any of the expense items. They are there for your informational purposes, and what they are intended to do is make you aware that as we move forward on the water side, we're really going to have three things we're going to need to work out. One, we're going to need to work out a situation where our revenue stream, as much as possible, covers our operating costs. And you can see that net operating cash flow in row 25. Two, we're going to have a revenue stream, or need to have a revenue stream, where we're going to have adequate cash reserves. And you can see that's a little bit of a problem on row 27 as we go into the out years. We're also going to have adequate revenues to meet a debt service coverage requirement, a minimum of 1.2 times. and I think I said 3 issues. 4 issues is we're going to have to figure out how to pay for these CIP expenses. And as Brian and Arturo and Elise and I move forward and begin looking at how to deal with the funding gap, and we do scenario analysis, we're going to need to cover our operating cash flows. We're going to need to maintain adequate cash reserves. We're going to need to meet a minimum debt service coverage. And we're going to have to figure out how to pay for these CIP expenditures. And so what we just wanted to identify for you today are some of these revenue and cost components and lay out for you what'll be some interesting challenges as we move forward to try to come up with that optimal capital financing strategy.
And John, can I interrupt you just real quick? I
Yes,
don't know if the board wants to talk about the water side before we get into the sewer side, or if we want to hear the full presentation and then discuss.
I'd like to take them one at a time.
Would that be all right with you, John? If we have some questions now before you get into the sewer side?
Oh, sure, that would be great. And hopefully I can answer them.
Maybe I'll start. That 2.1 customer growth, to me seems a little optimistic. I just was looking at our growth from the last 5 years, and it seems like each of those years was less than that 2.1. I'm just kind of interested in how you came about that number.
Earl, can you help me out on that 2.1 estimate and what that was based on?
I can answer that. That 2.1% was based on the previous master plan. So that was based on a combination of account growth and consumption from that plan.
Okay.
Thank you, Elise.
Any discussion, questions?
Can you,
Feel free to.
Arturo, can you expand on that a little bit? On the original master plan where that 2.1% was calculated, was that based on numbers provided to us through like CVEP and other Coachella Valley organizations?
It's primarily through the water and sewer master plan update and the growth that they saw coming through those numbers.
Okay, thank you.
I think,
Go ahead, John.
well, no, whoever raised this question initially, I think maybe the board chair, I think it's a really good question. Obviously the more optimistic the demand forecast is, the more palatable the situation becomes financially, and dialing back that customer account growth, will have an impact obviously on our revenues and ultimately our ability to cover our costs. I'm really glad you raised that question.
Well, that, and I know one that kind of stuck out to me was the utility. I think it was 7 or 7.5%. And I think the last few years we've seen that number larger than that 7%.
Ivan, do you recall what the number was that you saw for our last year growth? Do you remember?
We had like 180, I think, water connections. And if we have 14,000, that's
I'm looking at the information up right now. So
1.4 or
14,000,
something. I don't know.
14,000, 2% would be 280 new meters.
And I think we had 180.
And if you're going back into, I just pulled up the last general manager's report in 2021, 150, 21 to 22, 196, from 22 to 23, 205, fell down a little bit, in 23 to 24, it went to 93. And then already this fiscal year, we're at 159. So the 2% was probably accurate from a number going back a couple of years. But because the number is now 14,000 and not 13,000, the 2% may be a little bit aggressive from that perspective, let alone the 3.2, or excuse me, the 2.3, or I'm sorry, 2.1. Yeah. So we'll look at that number a little bit more closely.
Okay. I mean, I think whether it's smaller or not, it's obvious we need to make some kind of adjustment.
Yes. I know Skyborn is moving full speed ahead and looking at other properties. Will they bring in more than the 200 number? We'll see. But obviously there's a lot of talk of a lot of development around here, but also there's some concerns about the economy and where it's going too. So at some point that crystal ball is going to clear up I hope it's more than 2.1, but we'll definitely look at that number and come up with something a little bit more consistent with what we've seen the last 5 years.
I think just going back to what Mr. Wright had mentioned, we have a choice. We can be optimistic or conservative, and we have to decide which way we want the numbers reported to us. Do we want them conservative, or do we want them optimistic or somewhere in the middle? So I think we need to give some directions to how we want these numbers coming back to us.
I'd prefer more conservative.
Conservative.
Yeah, so do I.
I
So
agree. And just to bail out everybody and I just clicked in, if M2 comes online, we're going to get almost 500 new customers on the water side in that one
Yes, sir.
project alone.
Wait,
No, I'm sorry, that's not correct. It's 200. Excuse me?
So sewer, not water.
406.
so that's almost 2% of our.
But how many water customers are we going to pick up? Is it going to be like 80 or 100? Because we're only doing the top half, right? No, but we're
We can't
also,
hear his responses.
okay, yeah, but we're also doing a water line replacement through there, the rear yard easements. Oh, they're already connected, but we're moving them to the right of way. I see your point.
So it's not new connection.
It's not new connections. Thank you.
You might
I
want to
just
sit
had to
in the
work
front
through
row,
that.
you know,
Just
instead
had
of
to work
back
through
there.
that out loud.
They have them.
Yeah, we just had to work through it out loud.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
I think one thing to note about the non-operating revenues here in line 8, and I apologize, I would need to go back and investigate the fall from 25 to 26, the reduction. But I think the non-operating revenues feature maybe $600,000 of connection fee receipts. I don't know, Elise, if that number seems correct to you, but there's no assumption that you're going to raise your connection/capacity fees. So, you know, developing updated capacity fees was really not a part of our work with the district. But it's possible if you did an update, you may see a jump in capacity fee revenues. An interesting question is whether you want to build those into your cash flows. Because right now, just having an assumption that kind of stays static based on your existing fees is a more conservative approach, which I always like, to be honest with you. But
Yeah, there is for fiscal year 25 and onward, $370,000 budgeted for connection fee revenue.
got it.
Gentlemen,
So
go ahead, yes, I'm going to add to that. All right. So when you talk about, you mentioned future land development, future land growth there. How, I'm sure that it also applies to what your answer will also apply to the sewer connections. How are you going about knowing if there's going to be a 1-story house or a 2-story house or a 5-story condominium building put in later on for future land? So how do you figure that?
yeah, the only way you can really do that is look at what types of development that you believe you're going to see in the future. And admittedly, that may be a residential subdivision, it may be a multifamily, it may be some sort of non-residential property. And ask yourself, well, what type of meter is going to be serving those different land uses? And so, for example, if it's a single family residential subdivision, that's probably going to be a 3/4 inch or a 1-inch connection. And we know what your connection fees are for that size of connection. If it's going to be some sort of a multifamily property, maybe it has a 2 or 3 or 4-inch meter if it's a really large property. And we can express that in terms of, once again, the number of 3/4 or 1-inch connections. And then finally, if you're projecting to have a non-residential development take place of whatever type of industry, once again, there's going to be a meter size that we think that development's going to need. And we can also express that in terms of equivalent 3/4 or 1-inch connections. And using those 3/4 or 1-inch equivalent connections and what your current connection fees are, we can then try to forecast a revenue stream.
We really have to be looking at what may be developed years down the road, what has been developed and what we're missing on those properties to try to, I don't want to say we need to look into a crystal ball, but
Well,
it's complicated to look that far ahead and plan today for it, correct?
it's really, really tough to do that beyond, let's say, a 3 to 5 year planning horizon. It's probably even tough to do that beyond a 3-year planning horizon. Once you have a level of connection fee revenue, for example, that's being forecast for FY28, there's not much more you can do, but then roll that forward and grow it every year at whatever your sort of weighted average growth in customer accounts is.
So do you suggest that every 3 years we take a look at what the future growth might be in those areas and adjust the rates then, or just leave it the way we're going this way?
Yeah, yes, sir. What a lot of utilities do as it relates to connection/capacity fees is once they update their fees, is the first thing they do is that every year they adjust their fees upward based on the use of some sort of construction cost index. And a common one is published by an entity called the Engineering News Record. And then secondarily, they do on a 3 to 5 year basis look at updating their fees again, because they're going to be two things that are potentially going to change even over a short-term period like 3 to 5 years. One thing that's going to change is your CIP forecast. You might find that growth is happening a lot faster than you thought it would, or that it didn't materialize the way you thought it would. And your projection of growth-related infrastructure may change over a 3 to 5 year period. Not necessarily dramatically, but enough possibly to make a difference. And the second thing that can change also is, of course, land use patterns. And you can begin seeing changes in land use in at least an incremental way over a 3 to 5 year period. And that may change your long-term forecast of the number of connections you're going to have on the system. So that 3 to 5 year update is very, very helpful in that regard. And it's not much different than doing, for example, a 3, 4, or 5 year update of a water and sewer cost of service study. Over time, demand and cost changes happen, and the relationships between demand and cost modify.
Thank you. Appreciate the answer.
Rest did you?
Well, if it's okay, I'll show you sewer really quickly.
Thank you.
What's interesting to me about sewer as we look at our projection of revenue at existing rates in line 2 is that in sewer, the percentage of rate revenue as a percentage of total revenues, as you see in line 10, is very, very high. It's 80% roughly. On the water side, even though we have a really very nice, healthy water rate revenues, 7-8 million, we have a lot more non-rate items on water than we do in a sewer. But once again, this is a projection of rate revenue at existing rates. And here kind of a summarized projection of operating costs in row 13 through 19. I'm very interested in the commentary regarding what the appropriate electric power cost escalation assumptions should be. And I certainly don't want to go below the current estimate of 7.5, but it'd be interesting to know if 7.5 is accurate going forward. And then once again, on line 17, we have this item called allocated general and administrative expenses. And so sewer and water are getting a different amount of G&A. And Elise or Arturo, you may know what that split is of administrative overhead between water and sewer. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it's obviously line 17 is a big expense item. Now, something that's really, really interesting on row 21 under the debt service heading takes place in FY 2027. And it's a very big $15.2 million debt service item. And what this is associated with is you've got a $15 million line of credit with Wells Fargo. And this is the payback of that line of credit. You know, and Brian, you and I talked a little bit about this line of credit. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but we do have the payback of that line of credit taking place during our initial 5-year planning horizon.
The only thing I would add is it doesn't show up in our reserves. That's why it makes the reserves go so much lower in the wastewater side. That $15 million is not, the $15 million that is sitting in the line of credit, why it comes in as an expense is not sitting specifically in the revenues. Arturo, would you like to go through how they're calculating it, why it's not in a reserve per se, and why it's not just being taken out in the normal? Because in reality, we could bring that in as cash and then pay it off and still have the net zero, but.
Right, and you just answered it. It's not our revenue. It's something we're gonna have to pay back, therefore it cannot be counted as reserve.
So it's not reserve and it's also not revenue. That's why it doesn't show up in any of the things that Raftellus could show, because it doesn't fit easily in any of those columns. So that $15 million minus is really not necessarily there, but it has to be shown somewhat.
And to clarify, just additional clarification, my understanding is we haven't had to tap into that
We have not, and I just want to
and
make
it remains in the account.
correct.
Okay.
And I want to make a correction, that those $50 million actually come out in 2026, not 2027. Yeah, we extended.
December of 26, or no,
January of 26.
January of 26. Okay.
Oh, wow.
That's a big difference. Okay.
Wow, that's an important clarification, Arturo. Thank you for that. Well, okay, notwithstanding
Thank you.
that line of credit, Arturo, just out of curiosity, you're not really drawing on that line of credit.
Correct. It's sitting in our regular bank account, primarily because of the timing. We're not sure when the expenses are coming up. We've been waiting for the state to provide guidance as to when we can move forward with some of the projects, and other projects that basically have stalled due to timing and cost of the project and things like that. So that's the main reason.
And so, Arturo, just so that I understand, and board, please forgive me, I hope this isn't a incorrect digression, but your situation with this state revolving fund loan is you're basically on a spend and reimburse situation, right? You spend to build a CIP, then the state of California reimburses you. And so was that $15 million credit basically a line of credit, a way to help you potentially do that, to spend and then get reimbursed?
Correct. The state will take sometimes upwards of a year to reimburse us for those expenses. And when we were looking at our cash flow projections, we were dipping below our cash balances. And at that time, also, we had the investments that had losses on the gains of those investments. And so we didn't want to go into those as well, because we were going to lose potentially a lot of money on unrealized losses on those investments. So that was the strategy to prevent us from losing those funds.
Understood. Well, notwithstanding the $15 million line of credit issue, something that's really interesting to me in net operating cash flow is that your sewer utility is covering its operating costs. If you remember on water, we were maybe $500,000 short in covering our operating costs every year. As Brian once again noted in his preliminary comments, you do have one utility that is doing fairly well from the operating cost coverage perspective, and that is sewer, which is a really good thing. And then also we're strong on sewer debt service coverage, setting aside the $15 million line of credit. Now, once again, what's been shown in lines 13 through 28 is information that doesn't include your projected CIP expenditures. So the interesting question is how are we going to finance that CIP? What is a optimal strategy in the board's eyes. Once again, a combination of rate revenue and potentially other sources.
Can I interrupt you? So I have a question that before we get off that $15 million. Is the interest we're drawing on that $15 million still greater than the interest that the bank is charging for lending us the 15?
It's the same amount. We don't want to go over that amount because then we start to pay federal taxes and other fees. So we're keeping it at basically, that's the main reason it's sitting in Wells Fargo, because we're earning just about the same as what we're paying, so that we don't go over that amount.
And Wells Fargo isn't requiring us to make any payments on the 15 million?
The agreement is for us to only pay interest on that loan. So we're paying that interest at the end of every month and collecting that interest income on that amount as well.
Congratulations, I never heard this. Bank says, here's your money, just pay us interest, and the interest works out, so the bank isn't getting anything, we're getting the full benefit. That's some good mathematic figuring there, Mr. Salas. Thank you.
You know, so when we consider what we've shown you here today, you know, our firm, in working closely with Arturo, has developed financial plans that you know, have projections of all of these items, and the financial plans are basically showing projected cash sources and projected cash uses and cash reserves and that sort of thing. I think the next step for us in the process is, number one, to verify with Arturo and Brian that we're reflecting CIP correctly in here. We think we are, but I really want Arturo and Brian to sit down with us and really look at all of our projects and the timing of the projects. Make sure that they're in agreement also with the way that we are projecting inflation and customer account growth. And then when we feel really good about the inputs we've got on the cost and revenue side, the next step in the process would be to develop financial planning scenarios. And so just momentarily, let me talk a little bit about scenarios that my firm would often show to a governing body. And we're not there yet to show you anything. I just want to lay out some potential scenarios. One scenario that we often show to governing bodies is what we call the status quo financial planning scenario. Another way of saying that is the financial planning scenario where there's no rate increases. We don't do anything. We don't raise rates. We don't issue debt. We just keep everything the way it is, but we project forward our costs. And what you can see, as you might imagine, for most utilities is that the utility sort of runs off a cliff financially. All of our cash reserves turn negative. Our debt service coverage turns very negative. And we often show that to governing bodies because it's really helpful for a governing body to see what the stakes are if they don't take action. It can also be helpful for stakeholders to see that. And because a lot of stakeholders will say, well, you people are raising rates, you don't really need to do so. Well, if you look at projected revenues without rate increases versus costs with inflation, we do need to. So that's one scenario. Another scenario we often show to governing bodies is what we might call a rate revenue scenario, which is closing that funding gap through the use of rate revenue increases, so that the governing body can see that, who knows what it turns out to be, 8% in 26, followed by 7, 6, 5, 5, 5. You know, what is the profile of rate revenue increases in the smallest increments in the smoothest manner over time that will cover our costs? And then a third scenario, which in some cases, depending on how the governing body feels about the use of external debt financing, is a scenario that's a combination of rate revenue increases and maybe a moderate external debt financing. And so those might be scenarios we would look at. And of course, what we would also look at is scenarios that the executive team and you all, the board, might be interested in. But those are three common ones.
I think that would be great, John. I guess just to put kind of my opinion out there, I gotta try and probably go a long roundabout way to get there, but we recently did a capital improvement presentation, and we had them 5 years, 5 years, 5 years of what we hope to get done. And I don't really want to stray from that very much. But then I look at that line 28 reserves ratio or whatever that, and the water side was real scary that, a year or two from now, we're going to really be hurting in reserves if we use that money from reserves. I think we've seen the cost of everything going up, and putting the capital improvement projects off is just going to cost us more in the long term. And it's going to fall on our ratepayers, whether it's next year, 2 years from now, or 10 years from now. I'm not the biggest fan on the external debt, and I think that rates should help pay for a good amount of these capital improvement projects.
Understood. And I think from my firm's perspective, sir, what we would really like to see our clients do, what we'd like to see them do, is to have a legitimate capital improvement plan, which is not a gold-plated wish list, but it's a capital improvement plan that staff and maybe staff's third-party engineering consultant believe is necessary to do the following things. One is maintain your quality of service. And so that may be a level of repair and rehabilitation CIP expenditures that are necessary to do that, maybe deal with main breaks or whatever other problems might be happening, aging infrastructure, as well as the CIP that's necessary to meet your regulatory requirements. And then finally, there is going to be a level of CIP that's necessary to meet growth. If we develop that straightforward CIP plan, which is what I believe Brian and his engineering team and operations team have developed in those 5-year increments, then what we can do is sit down and see what it really means in terms of rate revenue increases. And if the required rate revenue increases are untenable because they're just too high, then it'll be up to staff to figure out a way to readjust the CIP and push things out. And so I like that solid CIP plan as a starting point, which I think is what you were indicating.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to put in my agreement with President. I would like to see rate schedules that will include all of our CIP projects as if we get not a penny from anyone anywhere. I would like to see that big, scary, dirty number for rates so that we can work from there backwards instead of repeating, I think, what unfortunately has happened here over the last couple decades. And that's, let's wait and see what happens and hopefully we'll get more money. And pretty soon, everything's going to break. We have to take care of what we have. And that is the responsibility of every single one of us as ratepayers. And that's to invest and reinvest into our infrastructure. So I just wanted to put that out there. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I would like to see rates that will show how to truly take care of our moving forward infrastructure as well as our existing. Thank you.
Director Duff, one of the things that I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of is also our reserve policies. Our reserve policies are very updated. There's really no guidelines as to how to put those in place. And at the end of the day, if we don't have a good working policy for reserves during an emergency, we really don't have a plan. And so one of the things I'm going to be asking John for as well, and hopefully to bring in the June workshop, is those policies that we can then implement or update the current ones to make sure that they are actually a working plan for us.
Okay. Thank you.
And Arturo, I just learned that we're having a June workshop. What would the board, Arturo, what were you and Brian planning to have the board see in June?
We'll get an update and then get back to you with some of the other questions so we can strategize. But one of the things I do want to come back with are those policies.
Understood, understood.
I'm not sure if I'm in agreement with the president and Director Duff. I'd like to look more into that and see really, because it's working so far for us.
Not really.
Not
We
really.
haven't been able to complete our projects.
What projects?
Our earthquake retrofitting, our regulatory obligations that we have, getting all of the septic to sewer stuff, we're dead in the water on that because we lost some of our grant funding. So we've got to figure out how to protect our groundwater at the same time as provide all these services.
Well,
And I think it's on us.
protecting our groundwater, I'm really not seeing.
Well, the leaking septic systems are really affecting the TDSs in our system. So it affects everything, right?
Yes, it does. Along with what the residents have on their properties, the homeless. I believe we were at the same meeting where they talked about dog waste in the yards. And unfortunately, I've seen some of that, and it's a big contributor to it. So you're right. We got to figure something out. And that's what I'm saying. I think we need more discussion as to what direction we can go without really hitting our residents hard on the rates.
Now,
Yeah, my only concern is what we did last time, which was to enact a 5-year plan. And none of us have a crystal ball about what our needs are going to be 5 years from now. And I don't like a multi-year increase. I might be able to compromise a 2-year. 5 years is just we may need it, we may need more, may need less. So
I agree with you there, Director Martin. And then we can compensate or charge them a little less once in a while.
I mean, it was explained to me at the time, said, well, we can always, if we don't need it, we can always withdraw the rate increase and not impose it. Yeah, like that's.
That's what we did for the 5th year, right?
I don't believe so. I think we stayed with 10%. And that's a good point. Our last rate increase was 2020. So we've been operating the last 5 fiscal years without a rate increase, even though we know what inflation has done over that same time frame.
One of the expenses that I'm concerned with is those connection fees. Those we have not updated in 20 years. And that's a significant number when it comes to our developer projects.
Well, and I think we're looking at the fixed charges as well as we're seeing this water's conservation way of life and our revenues decreasing from less water usage, but it's still not, I mean, the fixed charge, I think, is something we need to look at as well. And how you mentioned it, are coming back with 3 plans or multiple plans that show status quo versus aggressive rate changes. I think that's going to give the board a lot more data to kind of sift through to see what's going to work best. I think
it's
every year we're seeing the cost of everything going up, and I just hate us putting off too long. I'd rather see small incremental changes over time that our ratepayers could easily digest compared to let's wait another 10 years and then we've got to bump it up a huge amount. I mean,
understood. I have a client right now I'm working with in the San Gabriel Valley that will not be named, who's in a position of having to potentially have massive increases because they just let things go for so long. So that policy of trying to cover your costs on an ongoing basis is really a wise one. One thing I want to note about this schedule is that Elise and I think can complete the cost of service analysis using your existing rate classes by the end of June and develop proposed rates under your existing rate structures by the end of July. I think an interesting question is whether the executive team or the board are interested in alternative rate structures and what those alternative rate structures might look like and to what extent they will require additional analytics and require more time. But the schedule that's laid out here is under your existing rate structure. And, my understanding is so your existing rate structure was only implemented 4 or 5 years ago with the last study. And is that correct, Arturo?
It was implemented in 15 and then went into effect in 16. So it's almost a decade old.
Okay. But Brian, I don't know how you want to work it out from a scheduling perspective or to what extent you want to discuss the existing rate structure, what some of the pros and cons are, and what some other rate structures might be investigated. So I just
Don,
want to.
can you provide an example for the board as to what those might be?
Well, from my perspective, in looking at your water rate structure, you have a 2-tier single-family residential rate structure, and then your other customer classes pay a uniform charge, volumetric charge dollar per CCF. I personally think that's a very excellent rate structure and have no big issues with it. The one thing I would say about your current rate structure, though, Arturo, is that when you look at your monthly meter charges and what you're charging some of your larger meters, like a 4-inch meter connection, those connections seem a little bit low to me. But overall, there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, with the sewer rate structure. Now, the only other rate structure that you could move to in complexity might be a so-called water budget rate structure, where a monthly budget is established for customer consumption for every customer. And there are certainly water budget rate structures in the state of California, for example. Probably the closest one to you might be a Western Municipal Water District. And basically what those rate structures do is they do things like look at a single family residential customer's irrigable area, and they look at maybe even what type of vegetation they have, and they establish a monthly budget for single family residential usage that for each customer is geared toward climate and temperature changes across each month of the year. And if you are under a rate structure like that, and a single family residential customer might have an indoor budget that assumes a certain number of people per household, and that's billed at the lowest rate. And then they might have a second tier, which is for normal water usage, which is within the efficiency target. And then they might have another third or fourth tier that you pay more if you're over what the budget established by the utility is. On the commercial side, it's really hard to establish a budget for individual commercial customers based on their industry because there are so many types of industries. But the way the budget might be established is to look at a commercial customer's historical usage over the past 5 years, figure out what that average is. And if they exceed that 5-year average, they pay a higher rate because they're above their budget based on the 5-year average, or a lower rate if they're within the budget. Now, all of that can be done, and it can be done in a manner that is compliant with Proposition 218. Because remember, in California, every rate you charge has to be cost justified. But those types of rate structures, I'd say 2 things about them. One is you have to have a very sophisticated billing system that basically can integrate not only customer consumption data, but information that might be coming from your geographic information system, because you've got to track lot sizes for single family residential customers and irrigable areas. So you've got to have a billing system that can keep track of all that and issue individualized bills every month. And so there's some technical complexities that can often cause trouble with implementation unless you've got a really sophisticated internal system, especially on the customer billing side. They're also extremely analytically intensive to establish. If you wanted to go that route, it would require a lot of really heavy duty analytics. And so it can be done, and our firm has done water budget rate structures. And then I guess one other thing I want to add is that if you move in that water budget direction, you'll really need to have a lot of customer education and outreach to help your customers understand what you're doing, because it is a big change from what you're doing currently. So let me conclude that question of water budgets. That is a rate structure that is the next level of complexity for what you have. It's conceivable you could move to a rate structure where you're not charging single-family residential customer tiered rates, and they're just paying a monthly commodity charge, like your commercial customers do. So you could kind of move down in complexity. And board, I feel like I'm blabbing too much here in answering this question. I just want you to note that California is a very complex place. And for example, there's recently been a lot of litigation in California about whether or not you can have single-family residential tiered rates. I think my firm's conclusion, and we're not a law firm, is that you can, but it has to be really well documented. And I think we can achieve that level of documentation for your existing rate structure. And I'm sorry that was such a long-winded answer.
John, no, it wasn't a long-winded answer. In fact, I think the most important thing that you said there, it's very important that our customers understand why we're having a rate increase. Prior to me disagreeing about the ratepayers paying for everything, it was just going to kind of be left there. But then that brought on a lot of discussion of why we're raising the rates, and it allowed just what you said, more information being given to our ratepayers so they understand why we're doing this. And I think that's very important. And I appreciate you guys disagreeing with me. Because it really turned out to be a positive thing. Thank you.
Well, just to get back on the rate structure, I don't think I'm a fan of changing it. If you think that our current rate structure works and that we could defend the tiered rates, I think we've done a really good job these past few years educating our ratepayers, and they understand their bill. And to switch it up, I think that's going to be a lot more work for our staff, and I don't think it will be very positive outlook for our ratepayers to have to try and understand a whole nother process. I'd prefer to keep it the same.
And I agree with that. Also curious about, you're mentioning about the rates being tiered for residential, but you didn't mention them for, like, for instance, our industrial commercial users. Would you see that benefiting us if we were to add tiered rates to our commercial users?
No, ma'am, I wouldn't. And
Okay.
here's why, is that when you think about those commercial customers, we could be talking about everything from a insurance agency in a strip mall, right, through to a hospital.
Yeah, no, I'm more looking at just our industrial users in town that are like manufacturing plants and
John, let me take this one.
thank you.
So I've worked with an organization that had budget tiered rates on their commercial, and it was based on a 3-year average. And there's a lot of ways to look at commercial. The issues that we had with commercial and putting budget tiered rates or any type of expectations on a commercial property, I always look to a Starbucks. Starbucks finds a location in their first 3 years, they keep increasing, but it's what the water district is trying to do is actually trying to work against them to try to get them to conserve. So there's always this pull and tug with a business that is growing, that's helping the community thrive, and you don't want to stifle that. So I think that's where John's coming from, is you want to give them just a set amount and let them grow their business if they can. However, we know that we're going to be asked to conserve, and that's where I'm going to turn to some of our internal experts like Will Witten, who's gone through the spreadsheets and trying to figure out how do we take care of some of those. Cannabis, for example, is considered agricultural right now, and we hope it continues that way as we go through that. That way we can continue to support that industry, which is specific to us. So we're going to be looking at all of those things, but I agree with what John was saying. When you start doing those types of things on commercial businesses, you almost inherently are trying to fight against them, and I don't want to get in that position again. And there's ways you can do variances, and if we do go budget tiered rates, I will strongly encourage variances, because that's usually what keeps you out of court, because you give everybody an opportunity to come in and meet with you to work through that. But that's
I'm more concerned with some of our industrial commercial users that maybe have not abided by our sewer plans, but are still water customers, and they're overusing or maybe abusing the amount of water they use, and then we can't control where it's going. So I'm looking at a bigger picture than just one part of the rate, but instead, how can we assist that industry in conservation, as well as how can we help better protect both ends of our business when it comes to that. So that was part of where I'm just to explain where I was
no,
coming.
that's
you.
that's very helpful, and that's something we'll have to work through, because there are some, especially we could talk about cannabis, that do have other ways of disposing of their waste that may not be going into our waste stream, and we need to work with them to make sure that we take care of that, but also that they comply with our pretreatment limits. So that may be a specific group of folks that we have to handle separately, but giving them a flat rate and working with them to make sure they meet our pretreatment limits and how much they are actually discharging will probably go a long way in helping that particular group of customers.
Really concludes
Oh, go ahead.
my presentation. I think Arturo has Elise on speed dial. So he's got her number. And of course, Brian and Arturo both communicate with me a little bit. But that's where we are right now in this process.
So can I go ahead if there's any additional?
I think my only last thing, and I mentioned it on the water side, I didn't mention it on the sewer side, that rate of growth, I just like to see more conservative before you do your full studies.
Yes,
That 4% on sewer, I think we're really going to see a drop off now that we're having our issues with assessment districts and connections.
So what I had written down here, I basically have 5 things as we move forward to our June workshop. Look at the 2.1 service growth. Look at the connection fee review. For example, the Amazon facility made up almost 193,000 of connection charges in this fiscal year. So with some of the warehouses coming in, while we may be underestimating or overestimating, there's other things, other factors that go into that number that I think we want to look at a little bit differently. Obviously, cleaning up the line of credit, taking it out of the proper fiscal year. Also talk about debt service. How do we don't want to put a lot into debt service, but we do want to look at that as one of the tools. And I think John talked about that. And then you want to see a couple of different rate schedules. I know John talked about several different alternatives, but one of the ones you do want to see is what is the fully burdened cost, the worst case scenario, just to get an idea of what that is. And then we can do that with the capital, and then look at the grants and basically put them add a couple of rows, if you will, of here's the reserves, or excuse me, here are the CIP projects. Here's what we expect from a grant perspective, and then also list what those projects are. I had a list of all those projects that came up. It didn't come up this time, but we'll have another opportunity to look at this. We'll bring that to the board in June. Following the June workshop, knowing that he talked about having something specific at the end of July, we'll have a July workshop. At that July workshop, we'll bring back to you these changes. After we go through these changes in June, and when we start talking about in July, we'll start looking at the proposed financial plan and incorporating debt service to an actual rate structure. We'll start talking about what that rate adjustment may be if necessary. And then also at that time, talking about what what the impacts are of a reserve policy that Arturo talked about bringing to you in June. So with the process we have now, we have a June workshop, we have a July workshop, which is July 8th, and then we'll have another board discussion in July. And I think that will allow John to complete his study and set us up for a plan moving forward for the next 6 months. So that's just my 2 cents of how to bring it all together. John, I know again, every time we talk, it sounds like I put you behind the 8 ball on a schedule, but I guess that's what I'm good at, right?
You are very good at that.
But thank you for always meeting my expectations. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you all for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to item 8, procurement policy. General Manager.
Thank you, President Sewell. I'll ask our AGM, Marion Champion, to take this item. Marion?
Thank you, General Manager Macy. Good afternoon. Good morning, Board. Kurt's got my PowerPoint. He's going to pull it up. Today is just to start the discussion on our procurement policy update. We have several different policies that relate to our contracts and our procurement. What I have attempted to do is pull all of those policies into one master policy with some sub-policies that relate to it. You'll see when we start looking at these, our policies are really well written in the past, but there are some areas where we can improve upon it, give more detail to staff, and just have better guidance. They are also, we did these a while ago. You'll see, and some of these we approved these back in 2013 and since then. So there has been some changes. You know, things like now we are doing a lot more things digitally. So there have been some changes. Really, we're going to be improving the clarity, the consistency between all of our different departments. This will reduce risk for the organization, and also it'll give a smoother onboarding for newer employees like myself who may not have been here in 2013 when we passed some of these things. This also aligns really well with the fact that we now have a contracts analyst. Amanda is handling all of our procurement. We've got the new OpenGov software. So by updating these policies, this really aligns with what she's doing already. It also helps us with our CSDA and our District of Distinction transparency efforts by updating these policies. That is something that is a requirement as part to keep that certification going. I will tell you that I did look at Desert Water Agency, CVWD, Imperial Irrigation District, and some of the CSDA templates when we were looking at language and looking to make these improvements. I'll get into it a little bit further, but this is about a 35-page document. So today it is really just a chance for you to be introduced to the document, to start the dialogue and changes. There's nothing in here that is necessarily set in stone. I have had John and his team from SBEMP look at the document. So there's nothing in here right now from a legal perspective that has raised any flags on his behalf. So it's just some of the updates here. For the most part, none of the dollar amounts have really changed. The only area that I did make an adjustment on the dollar and approval amounts was with the general manager's signing authority. In his contract, it does specify $100,000. However, in our procurement policy, we do say $75,000. So that's what we have been doing from a day-to-day perspective on a staff level. We have been following what is in our procurement guidelines. And so I do have it proposed here to increase that. But again, that will be under board's discretion and decision. It's going to combine all of our contracts and procurement documents into one policy with related sub-policies. As I said, it updates the signing authority tables and allows for digital approvals and designated board approval for the board president and vice president in his absence. It also updates the competitive bidding guidelines, which we are already using. It adds credit cards to the procurement authorization table. They were not included originally in that table. It updates the general manager's signing authority again and aligns with his employment contract. It adds the role of assistant general manager to the signing authority and procurement authorizations tables. I believe when it was passed, we didn't have an AGM, and so that's why that needs to be added. creates an expanded list of exempt purchases and payments that don't conform to competitive procurements, things like our utility payments or our JPIA insurance payments, advertising and other things that are not necessarily something that you go out to bid for. Some of the other changes that are here. We've increased our petty cash fund. Originally, it was $350 with a $35 limit. We've moved it up to a $500 limit with a $50 or less for reimbursements. We created a new paper or hand-delivered check request policy. For the most part, all of our checks are now written and distributed through our payment processing through Wells Fargo. They go directly to our vendors, but there are occasions where we'll need a hand paper check. I'll give you an example. One would be, let's say I'm doing an event, and when the tent crew comes to set up that tent, they want that final payment when they're putting the tent there. And so that would be a time when we would need a paper check. And we've created a new form with Will's help. As Brian mentioned, Will's been helping us modernize a lot of things. We have a new online form that we've rolled out, but we want to make sure that this is accounted for now within our policy. Arturo also provided a new capitalization policy that'll be at the very end of the document when you look at it. We also established a credit card secretary who's responsible for the reconciliation of cards, and also defined a process for employees who need to check out. Let's say there's an employee who does not necessarily use or travel frequently. Instead of them having to pay for their travel out of their pocket and they get reimbursed, because those are usually, your hourly employees, your lower level employees. Instead, we now have a process. We've established a process so they can check out a card with this defined spending amount that they can go and use for those travel purposes. We also updated the vendor processing policy. Again, like I said, now we use Wells Fargo to actually cut checks. Before we would cut them here in the office. So that's a change from what we used to do. We also created a standardized single and sole source justification form. In the past, we've used a memo for that responsibility. Now we actually have some defined questions so that we'll get more detail on those before they get sign off. We also added some information about our insurance requirements when it comes to procurement and contracting. Now our vendors, as it states in our RFPs, we now have that actually here in our policy, how much that insurance that we're requiring. It also allows for electronic signatures. A lot of the contracts that Amanda is sending out, she's using DocuSign currently to send those out to vendors and get a digital signature. This allows for that, whereas we didn't have that ability when we first approved this in 2013. And then it also gives some real world examples. That's something I stole from another agency. I thought that was really helpful for new employees coming in, how they can apply this, especially when it comes to like change orders, things like that. I think it's really great to show some of those real world examples. Slide. So again, this updates the $100,000 for the general manager, and it aligns with what we currently are doing, but then makes that one small change. It also added credit cards to the authorization table. The next is the signing authority. That did not change. That has stayed the same, except for I did make note about wire transfers and electronic approvals, which we didn't have before, and also adds the board onto this one. Next slide. The next one is the single source justification memo. As I mentioned before, it will replace just a general memo that we were doing before, and it gives some structure of the types of information that we're asking employees for before they can get this approved. Slide. We also have the petty cash disbursement policy. As I mentioned, this one is changing a little bit because we increased the amount to $500 from the $350 threshold that we had prior. And it also makes expenses up to $50. The next one is our paper / hand delivered check policy. Again, this one is a new policy, and that will allow for those odd times when we do need a paper check in hand. It makes it so that staff has a process to get those. Next one, third. This is our credit card policy. This one again adds the ability so that we have a credit card secretary. Right now, Dory is filling that role, and she's doing a very nice job with that, going through and reconciling and making sure that we have all of our statements in line. This just provides some clarity. It does not change the per diem or the amounts for travel. It does just reference that that resolution when we adopted it in 2024. It's the last time we updated that. Next one is our, we just did the credit card policy, I'm sorry. The next one is, go ahead and get the next one is the capitalization policy. And this is a new one. Again, we can take a look at that, look at levels, and if anybody has changes or thoughts on that, we can make those edits. My plan is to bring this back to you again as another informational item in May, because this is a lot of information to digest. If anyone would like copies of the original resolutions, we can provide that. A lot of it is actually incorporated in our codification on the website, so it's already there. We will need to make a change to the code, the codification as we adopt these. So that's something I would be looking to do in action when we adopt it, hopefully in June. So when we come back in June for action, we'll look at it from a, how do we update the code, the resolutions, the policy all at one time. And that's really it. That's all I wanted to do today, was just kind of introduce it to you. I know I've already had a couple of changes come from some staff members already, so I welcome any edits and changes. It's a lot of information to pull together into one document. So hopefully we can be collaborative and make changes that are appropriate together.
Great.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Now, thank you for introducing this to me. I guess I'm gonna have to spend a couple hours on this to familiarize myself with it, which in turn means you're gonna have to spend some time answering some of my questions. But we have plenty of time to do that.
Glad to do it. Glad to answer any questions you have.
Thank you.
Great work. I look forward to looking it over in more detail. I did catch just one thing since you're here on page 27, where it was the check signing authority. I believe you would want to add that the general manager can sign under 75,000 as well as the AGM.
Yeah, anything up to. So
So
I'll
we'll
make
wanna
some
have-
clarity there.
2 check marks, and then isn't it 500,000 and above requires GM and board member? So he actually would be on all 3 of those, is that correct? Or did we, okay,
It would, before it gets to you, he'd have to sign, but I'll make clarity on that.
that was all I saw from my glancing. I look forward to the read though, and great work, thank you.
Yes, thank you for putting it all together. And I know it was mentioned to go up to the 100,000. Do you know the last time that 75, or when that 75 was done? I mean, to me, it makes sense to go up to 100,000. I think my entire time on the board, it's been 75, and
I really don't.
just cost of
I'd have to research it, but I could research it.
It's been a while.
We can't hear whoever's speaking. Please come to the
Hold on,
podium.
Billy. He didn't fit. I was going to summarize once he finished.
Sorry.
Sorry, President. So that amount came from our previous policy for cash handling and major project. Our major projects number was 75,000. And that was consistent in basically everything we did, everything on over 75,000. We brought to the board no matter what, but obviously that needed to be revamped. Part of the reason why we're bringing that capitalization policy is because some of those things don't need to come to the board, but they are within the amount that we need to capitalize. So now we have a formal process to do that. So it cleans both of those things up.
Great.
So for Dory, that was 2013 and then 2018.
2018 dash.
When these were both looked at previously.
Great. Well, thank you. Great job. Any other comments, questions? Moving on to item 9, general manager comments.
Thank you, President Sewell. I just have one. I think all of you have been invited to the Employee Appreciation Luncheon tomorrow. Hope to see all of you there. I know we're very excited about that from a staff perspective. And if any of the public would like to reach out to us after that, we will not be manning the phones or anything like that in celebration of our day. So I apologize about any inconvenience, but we'll be able to be back here at 7:30 to help anybody that has any additional questions at that time. But looking forward to tomorrow and looking forward to seeing all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 10, director comments and requests.
I just want to apologize. I won't be able to make it tomorrow to the employee appreciation. I kind of feel bad about it, but I'd like to thank all the employees for the effort and work that they put in.
Director Duff.
Yes, I look forward to that as well. I will be there. And then just a brief comment, the See Something, Say Something campaign that we're running is great. I would like to have us look into the after hours phone system. It is not great. I was on hold over 20 minutes trying to call and tell somebody that there was a pipe spraying water into Palm Drive. So we need to make sure that if we're asking people to say something, that they can say something. Thank you so much.
Will do.
And not to just, I've only called the after hours once and it was real smooth and easy, but that was maybe 2 years ago. So hopefully it's just a bad day. And I too, to echo Director Meyerhoffen's comments, I am unfortunately not able to make tomorrow, but I'm very appreciative of all our staff and I hope that the event goes well. So with that, meeting is adjourned.
We're in